Hi there. This is going to be a presentation on Bernstein's Omnibus Telecast from 1954 on November the 14th, entitled Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. In this telecast, Bernstein attempts to explain Beethoven's compositional genius. Bernstein discusses that there are two challenges that every composer faces, that of deciding what is the correct melody and that of deciding what is the best form or development that will justify the choice of melody. He also talks a lot about the inevitability of Beethoven's compositions, that Beethoven's compositions are really perfect in their final form, and that Beethoven's job was to find the inevitable in choosing what note had to be the next note to follow the one that preceded it. The first thing that Bernstein does in this telecast is that he contrasts three different melodies that Beethoven considered for the beginning of the second movement. In this, he ends up stressing Beethoven's genius by telling the audience that it took Beethoven over 8 years just to decide on what melody to use, let alone to decide how to develop it. This logic is somewhat flawed because we listen to three different versions of the melody, and as a listener, it becomes apparent that each of these melodies is beautiful in its own right, and we must give Beethoven some credit that had he chosen any of these melodies, he probably could have created a work of great substance, regardless of whether or not they were the correct one in Bernstein's eyes. Next, Bernstein segues away from this contrast before he moves on to the discussion of form, and talks about the meaning of music. He says the meaning is not in the theme. The meaning of the music is not in the extra musical things that we assign to it, but that the meaning of the music is in what follows the theme. And we can really reduce this into saying that obviously Bernstein could have said that the meaning is really the form. This contrasts with various things that Bernstein has said in the past. For example, in his Imaginary Conversations from the Joy of Music, he discusses that with the lyric poet that the meaning of music is really absolute, and that music cannot be described in words. It can only be described in the music that it is itself. But the statement that the meaning of the music is what follows the theme, is really the development, is to say that the meaning of the music is form, and dismisses the role that the theme itself plays in the meaning of the music. From this, we go on to discuss orchestration. And Bernstein pulls up a version of the score that Beethoven had written that originally for the intro that included flute. Backed by the New York Phil, he has this played first with flute and then without the flute. And Bernstein tells the audience then that obviously we can determine that Beethoven chose not to use the flute because he wanted to have a more masculine or courageous sound to the very beginning, and the flute, which he equivocates with like the voice of a soprano, just doesn't fit that mood. Unfortunately, as convincing as Bernstein's argument might actually be, we don't know if that was really the reasoning behind Beethoven's decision because he's unfortunately not here with us for us to ask. Moving on from that, Bernstein begins to contrast various developments. And he does this by taking drafts of Beethoven's and placing them into various spots of the symphony. At the piano, he contrasts these things for us and plays one first, usually first, the original as we know it, and ascribes it to be perfect again. Then he plays another version and will discuss the various qualities that make this both attractive and that also discuss the things that make this version less perfect or just not inevitable in the end, and really try to explain why Beethoven made his decisions. This logic appears on the surface to be very convincing. It gives an oral idea to the audience of what things could have sounded like, and perhaps, they might feel too that, yes, at this moment this does not build as much, or yes, I can definitely see that the climax is just not as big. However, we do have to keep in mind that had Beethoven continued to use the draft music, the alternative music that Bernstein is showing us, he may well have developed the symphony in a completely different way. He may also have, the music may, in the words of Bernstein, could have taken on a different meaning. And it's not to say that it would be the wrong meaning. It would just be a different meaning, as the music is the meaning in and of itself. So in this, Bernstein really puts his own ideas, his own reasoning into the production in explaining how Beethoven was thinking. From this, continuing on, Bernstein also continues to stress Beethoven's genius. He does this by comparing a draft of a score from Beethoven to a draft of a score from Stravinsky. Unfortunately, there are several issues that are not really discussed in front of the audience in doing this comparison. First, we don't know at what point these manuscripts were written. It could well be that the Stravinsky was written at a much later point in his compositional process, because we know that Stravinsky kept sketchbooks just as Beethoven did. The Beethoven sketch looks very harried, many things are crossed out, there's been lots of editing, whereas the Stravinsky looks quite clean, quite proper. The Beethoven could have been an earlier draft, something that was happening only a couple of months into the composition of a work, and the Stravinsky could have been very near a finished product. In addition, the other thing that is flawed in this logic is that it doesn't take into account that Beethoven lived in an era that in which paper and pen and might have been a little less easily accessible and might have been a little bit more expensive than the readiness with which Stravinsky would have found these things nearly 100 years later. To continue, I think that Bernstein's presentation appears very effective to the audience. He explains things, or explains at least possibilities for understanding compositional process to the average person very clearly. He does not get lost in musical jargon, and he makes his argument rather persuasive. Unfortunately, his argument it's really his, and it's what Bernstein thinks about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and is perhaps a little bit less about what Beethoven's compositional process actually was. The discussion of the two issues a composer faces is really quite revealing, and this can actually be perhaps a little less useful in understanding Beethoven's compositional process, and perhaps even more useful applied to the analysis of Bernstein's compositional process.